That's why you should think about Agile software being delivered in a slightly different way. If you're familiar with project management, then you're probably familiar with the iron triangle. And this is sort of the budget, schedule, and scope, the triangle that you'll see in project management. And then there's quality sort of within the triangle. And the idea is, if you're a project manager, that the reason they call it the iron triangle is that these things are very closely linked. If you want to increase the scope, this is what your product will do, then you also have to increase the schedule and the budget. And if you decrease the budget, then you have to either decrease the scope or decrease the schedule. It's very difficult to decrease the schedule without decreasing the scope. And so all of these three things are interlocked, and you can't sort of pull on one without affecting the other two. So the way Agile approaches this is a little bit different. You should think of the schedule and the budget as being like a vase. And then you fill up the vase with the amount of scope that you want in your final product. And the way that you fill it up, remember, is based on that little pie chart, is you want to start out with the highest value sort of parts of your scope first, as you want to sort of fill it up with the highest value going up. Now, budget and schedule are still fixed in an Agile team. Remember that you want your team to deliver every 2 weeks. Remember the Agile Manifesto, the principles, that the continuous and predictable delivery of software. So your schedule should be fixed. You should be delivering every sprint or every 2 weeks or whatever you determine ahead of time. And your budget is also fixed because your team should be fixed. So you'll know how many people are on your team and how much it will cost to have them for 2 sprints or 4 sprints or 5 sprints, because that's fixed. And so you can understand how much your team costs and how much it costs sort of each sprint. So that's the schedule. Now, what you don't know is what your product will deliver, because remember, your product owner or your customer can pivot to take advantage of new information. And so it's going to fill up your sprints with the amount of scope that your customer identifies. Remember, think of the pie chart as the highest value stuff, and then fills up over time. So instead of thinking of it like an iron triangle where you have all 3 points that are fixed, you should really think of it almost like an iron vase, where you have your budget and your schedule fixed, but then you're filling up the scope, filling up the vase with scope. And the quality is baked in. Remember, that's part of the principles in the Agile Manifestos. You have to deliver high quality software so that you don't have technical debt, so that you can build it up over time. That's also why teams that embrace a more agile mindset discourage multitasking. If you go out and you look for jobs on one of the job boards, you'll see that very many of the applications say something like, must be able to multitask, must be able to sort of do several things at once. But from an Agile perspective, multitasking actually adds a lot of variability to your sprints. Remember, you have to think of that pie chart. It's the highest value items. That's 7%. That's what you want your team completely focused on. And so if your teams are multitasking, then they're not necessarily working on that 7%. So you want your team completely focused on delivering these small chunks, predictably, of the highest value items. And that teams that multitask have trouble sort of not only focusing on that 7%, but it also makes it much more difficult to deliver predictably. Because if you think about it, most of the reason that people multitask is because they're waiting for someone else to do something. They're waiting for someone else to deliver something, or they're waiting for the organization to do something. And so it becomes much more difficult to predict when you're going to be finished with that task, because you could get it at any time. That other person could finish in a week, they could finish in a month. You don't know. So you pick up something else and you start multitasking. Now, that solution of multitasking has a consequence, and that is it becomes much less, you become much less able to predict when you're going to deliver what you've promised, because you're waiting on someone else. Now, to embrace an Agile mindset, you focus completely on delivering one team. Your team scrums, if you use the Scrum framework, on this one item, and then they push it forward. And so you don't want sort of several different things going on at once. Instead, you want to focus on that 7% a little bit at a time and you want to have your team completely focused on it and not multitasking. See, the thing with multitasking is not that many people recognize that there's a lot of multitasking overhead. It's kind of based on this old Russian proverb that if you chase two rabbits, you won't catch either for dinner. And so there's a lot of overhead when you're trying to do several things at the same time. And this overhead is because of one of the reasons for this overhead is this confine of the 40-hour work week. And so if you think about the 40-hour work week is a construction that also came out of Ford Motor Company. It was Henry Ford recognized that if he had his workers there for more than 8 hours, that productivity would actually start to go down. So he created this 40-hour work week. Now this was way back when people were working sort of manufacturing things, and it doesn't necessarily work well when you're doing software development, which is much less physical and much more creative. And so you can't really think of the 40-hour work week as something that you should be doing several things at once. Instead, to embrace a more agile mindset, you have to focus on one thing. And if you ask people what's the most efficient way to do a task, most of the time they won't say multitasking. Like if you said to someone, hey, you have 3 hours to make a sandwich before you go on lunch break, that person's not going to be like, okay, well, I'll start sort of putting the bread down and then I'll go and send an email, and then I'll run to have a quick meeting, and then I'll come back and put some cheese on there, and then I'll go downstairs for a quick walk, and then I'll come back and put the other slice of bread on there. Is most people recognize that the most efficient way to do something like that is just to get it done. Is you sort of fix it, you finish your sandwich, and then you move on to the next thing. And that when you add too much overhead, or when you add too many tasks, you add a lot of overhead. And that overhead causes tremendous amounts of inefficiency. So if you think about doing your tasks one at a time, you actually pick up on a lot more work time. So if you're doing one task, then you typically can dedicate 100% of your mind, your effort to finishing that task. But if you're doing 2 tasks, then people don't recognize that you can only really dedicate about 30% of your mind to sort of your attention to finishing that task. And then the other sort of 20% is figuring out the overhead, is sort of switching from one task to the other. Now, if you've worked on several tasks, you probably recognize overhead. It's like if you're writing an email and someone calls you, then it's sort of the amount of time that it takes for you to hang up the phone and then figure out where you were in your email. So that's sort of like the overhead. Or if you're writing an email and sort of like another email comes in with a red exclamation point, and so the time it takes you to read that other email and go back to where you were, that's overhead. And so the more tasks you add, the more different things that you're working on, the more overhead you have. So if you're working on 3 tasks, then you actually have more overhead than working time. And if you're working on 4 tasks, then you have sort of way more overhead than working time. And once you get into 5 tasks, then you may not even, it doesn't even worth it really to be working, because you're spending most of your time sort of trying to figure out what you're doing so that you can switch to the next task. And so that's why embracing a more agile mindset encourages teams to sort of think more like the sandwich, is that you finish what you're doing and then you move on to the next thing. You don't work on several things at the same time. You don't want your team multitasking on several different things. And so in Scrum, they have this old saying that you should stop starting and start finishing. Don't start several different things. You have to finish what you're doing and move on to the next thing. And so that helps your team become more predictable. And it eliminates what you'll find out later in Scrum, what are called handoffs, where you have sort of handoffs from one team to the next. And so you're completely focused on finishing your task and then moving on to the next thing. And you'll see that in Scrum teams, they'll have user stories that they task out and they finish the user story and then move on to the next one. And they're prioritized based on the product backlog, which you can think of almost like that pie chart. The highest value at top, and then you work your way through it. And so you're completely focused on finishing that highest value thing, and you're not multitasking because you want to be the most efficient that you possibly can, most efficient that you can possibly be, because you don't want so much overhead eating up the time in each one of your sprints. because if you're using Scrum, then you're going to be delivering every 2 weeks. And so you want to be predictable. And if you have a lot of overhead, and if you have a lot of multitasking, then it's going to make the team less efficient.